This is the class, Why Four Gospels, and this is Class 1, Video 2. The topic is, what is a gospel? The Gospel of Mark, which most likely was the first gospel written, begins this way. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's Mark's opening line. Mark is not writing a history. Mark is proclaiming good news. Mark's account proclaims the good news in a particular way with certain emphases relevant to Mark's community of faith. A gospel is part historical memory and part sacred myth, which proclaims the good news of God's presence and activity in Jesus of Nazareth in ways that are relevant to that community of faith. Now let me clarify what I mean by a sacred myth. A sacred myth is a story that is not historical or factual, but is true on a deeper level than the historical. Before a Native American chief shared the story of his people's beginning with the group that had assembled, he said, "I don't know if this happened or not, but I know this story is true." The truth of a sacred myth is in the meaning of the story, not the historicity of the story. The truth of a sacred myth is in the meaning of the story, not the historicity of the story. For example, the two stories of creation in the book of Genesis are sacred myths. They are not historical stories. They are not factual accounts of how everything began. They are metaphorical narratives. They are theological stories. They are spiritual stories. The stories communicate truth about God and the world and God's relationship to the world, to creation. But they are not stories containing factual information on how God created the world and everything in it. If we make the two stories of the book of Genesis factual or historical accounts, then the stories clearly contradict what 99% of scientists around the world believe and teach. For many people, that would make faith impossible. Rather, the two stories of creation in the book of Genesis, as well as most of the stories in the book of Genesis, are religious stories that disclose truth, reveal truth, and teach wisdom on a level deeper than the historical. So our canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do not intend, that's not their purpose, they do not intend to give factual reports about past happenings. And as I emphasized in my first video, they are primarily spiritual narratives, theological narratives, metaphorical narratives that proclaim the meaning of Jesus for our lives. Now, there is history in the Gospels, but history is not the intent. History is not the design. It is not the purpose of the Gospels. The Gospels are proclamations of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, as John says in his as Mark says in his opening line, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, last Sunday, our gospel text from Matthew focused on Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include this confession, though Matthew includes material unique to Matthew, not found in Mark and Luke. Now, Mark's gospel has Peter say, "You are the Messiah," speaking in his confession of Christ. You are the Messiah. Luke's gospel has Peter say, you are the Christ of God. Matthew's gospel has Peter say, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then there is a section in Matthew that is unique to Matthew, which was the subject of my sermon last Sunday. Now, this text is a good text to use to illustrate what interpreters mean when they say that the Gospels are first and foremost theological. And as I said in my first video, I prefer the word proclamational because I think it simply communicates better. The confession that Peter makes is a post-Easter confession, which is read back into the life of Jesus. Now, did Peter actually say something like this? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. The meaning of the confession, though, can only be understood in the light of what the early followers of Jesus had come to believe after Easter. That is, after they became convinced that God raised Jesus from the dead. According to the author of Luke and the book of Acts, this was at the very core of the early Christian preaching. In the first sermon composed by Luke in the book of Acts, Peter says to the Hebrews gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the festival of Pentecost, Peter says that their sins expressed through the actions of the Jewish leaders, sins we are all guilty of, their sins killed the man Jesus. But God raised him up. It's always God who raises the man Jesus. Jesus never raises himself. We killed Jesus. Our sins killed Jesus. We put Jesus to death. God raised him up. And then Luke says, and this is at the heart of and core of the early Christian preaching. Then Luke says, God made Jesus. God appointed Jesus. God declared Jesus to be both Lord and Messiah. The very one they, through their actions of the Jewish leaders, had crucified. God made Jesus both Lord and Messiah. That's a post-Easter confession. That is a post-Easter understanding of Jesus. And in the narrative of the story of Jesus, it is read back into the story as a means of proclamation. The stories of Jesus in the Gospels are told from this point of view, post-Easter point of view. The text that I preached from last week in Matthew, where Jesus says to Peter, in material that's unique to Matthew, after the confession, he says, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, my ecclesia, my beloved community. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now, from the point of view of Matthew's gospel, Matthew's author and readers, this is the risen Christ speaking to Matthew's community. I mean, this is, in their understanding, the risen Christ speaking to the church that had gathered in the name of Christ. In fact, these words, there's no way to prove this or disprove this, but these words may have been used as a litany in the worship services of Matthew's faith community before Matthew incorporated them into his gospel. It is a post-Easter point of view. And it is the risen Christ speaking, not the historical Jesus speaking. Even though it reads as Jesus speaking in the narrative. Now, to summarize so far, a gospel, such as we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is part memory, it's part historical reflection of the life of Jesus, but mostly proclamation of the meaning of Jesus for that particular faith community, for the readers of the gospel. And we will see this even more clearly when we look at some of the unique emphases of each of the gospels. These stories of Jesus in the gospels often contain bits and pieces of historical reflection, memory of what happened or what was said, but their main purpose is to proclaim the meaning of Jesus to their readers.